This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions about software engineering topics at least once a month. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast.
Welcome to a new show on Software Engineering Radio. Our topic is software development in large agile settings. My guest today is Bas Vodde, and the microphone is Michael. Bas is an agile coach running his own company and is very experienced in large agile settings. Bas, why don't you introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Bas Vodde. I'm originally Dutch, so originally from close to where you are, Michael. I have not lived there for a long time. I now live in Singapore. I work in a small coaching company called Agile. Before that, about 10 years ago, I still worked in several smaller, at that time, the .com companies in Holland. And then I had enough of living in Holland, and I packed my suitcase and moved to Beijing, China, where I joined a small company called Nokia. And I lived for a year in Beijing building ADSL equipment, software for ADSL equipment. Then I got transferred to Hangzhou, China, where we started working on large third-generation network elements. After a couple of years, I had the opportunity to introduce Agile iterative development, which was kind of what I was more used to when living in Holland, but we'll talk about that later. I had to move to Finland, so I moved to Finland and to Helsinki, where I run a change project for Agile iterative development on the whole organization. It was supposed to be a pilot, but it got out of hand. And after that, after 2 years, I decided to move away from Finland again because it's a very cold place to live. And I first moved to Hangzhou, so back where I was, to move back to the old product to try to help them adopt Scrum on the whole product, which was about 500 people. And then after that, I moved to Singapore, where it's never cold, and worked with my own company called Agile. And now we offer Agile coaching mainly in Asia, and we got Agile Japan and Agile Japan and Agile China, and we got some people in Hong Kong also. So it's going pretty well.
So you also wrote 2 books where you collected and shared all your experiences. What do they focus on?
Okay, so I wrote 2 books together with a good friend of mine, Craig Larman. We have been working together for many years within Nokia and later on Nokia Siemens Networks, and so they're both about scaling agile and lean development, and they're structured in such a way that the first book is more conceptual. So it talks about we took the concept of thinking tools from Don Reinertsen's book on product development, Next Gen, I forgot what it's called now, and the product design, the design factory. And so it's the first half of the first book is full of thinking tools such as queuing theory, systems thinking, lean thinking, and it describes how to think about the organization or how to think about the development. Then the second part of the first book we called organizational tools, And in the organizational tools, we'll describe how to structure your organization. One of the key chapters there is the chapter on feature teams, which describes how you can structure your organization in a different way than traditional organizations, what the benefits of doing that are, and also what the drawbacks of doing that are. And then the last part of the first book is a book called, a chapter called Organization, and it just basically goes over all the organizational issues that you will have and gives advice on how you can change your organization or what kind of things you might expect when being in an agile transformation. The second book is called Practices for Lean and Agile Development, and as the title suggests, it focuses on practices. So there's for example, a chapter called Test. We decided to do Test first, so that's the first chapter. A chapter called Test, which describes how testing issues related to agile development, and then specifically focused on testing issues that are common in larger scale projects. And then it goes from test to design to planning, product management, contracts. So the second book is structured around topics of practices, and then gives tips related to these practices. Both books are organized around tips or experiments where we suggest to try out something or to not do something. And they try to avoid making too much you must follow this one way type of advice.
So you mentioned that you had the opportunity to start iterative and basically agile development. Was that something you were looking for a long time, or how did agility get started with you?
For me, it started before the Agile Manifesto. At that time, which is a long time ago, at that time I was working with a .com company in Holland, and we were kind of feeling uncomfortable that we were not developing our products in the way as we were taught and as all the literature says the way we should be doing it. We had been experimenting with CMM at that time, which was very new, but it just didn't fit well at all. And at that point, Kent Beck's first extreme programming book was published, and I got a copy of that immediately. And when we read through it, was like, oh, so we are not the only persons thinking that the traditional way doesn't work. And it described a lot of practices which we were already doing, and then a couple of practices which we hadn't been thinking about very much at that time. So we started adopting some of these also. So my first Agile experiences were extreme programming experiences right after, around the period that the first XP book was published. And at that time, it was obvious, it was common knowledge that Agile development didn't work in large-scale products. It only works for small teams.
That would have been my next question. Well, some people still claim that agility only works for small teams, let's say less than 10, less than 20 people. So why should agility work for large software development teams with for example, more than 100 developers?
So at that time, when I got exposed to Agile development, it was mainly about extreme programming. But then when I joined a large product of hundreds of people, I went back to the traditional way of development, since everybody knows that Agile development doesn't work for large projects. And I accepted that common knowledge at that time. So we tried to get traditional development to work, and traditional development also doesn't work for large projects. So it's not like you have to choose between Agile development that doesn't work and traditional development that works. You have to choose between Agile development that was common knowledge that didn't work, and traditional development that also didn't work. And we tried really, really hard to get it to work. In fact, we wrote a couple of experience reports on improving software inspections, which we were very, very active in, because that was the only way to get the early feedback in a more waterfallish cycle. And I think we got as far as we could with improving the traditional software inspection process. But it still didn't work very well. So we already started piloting in smaller teams some of the Agile practices. So when I had the opportunity to run this organizational-wide change process, for me it was going back to my roots. It was like, I know this works. I've done that years ago. I know the traditional development doesn't work. So let's just try to get Agile development to also work on larger scale projects. And at that time, there was nothing written or known about Agile development at large scale projects, except for Ron Crocker's Motorola project, which was supposedly going to be published in a book, but it never got published. And that was about all there was known about Agile development in large-scale projects at that time. So why should it work on large-scale projects? The same reason why it should work on small-scale projects. There's not much difference.
I have actually read a book by Bas Vodde titled Software Engineering Best Practices. And he makes the claim that agility doesn't work for large software teams, and tries even to have a proof for it. Well, he says, you need to use the team software process to be successful in large development. What is your experience with it?
Well, first of all, Capers Jones has done it's about one of the only person providing reasonably useful information from research-based information in our industry. So whatever he says, I think we should at least take serious. Though my experiences are very much counter to him trying to prove that Agile wouldn't work on large-scale software development. And we'll get back to TSP a little bit later. And I've been thinking about why the data he and others collect are suggesting that Agile doesn't work, or that it doesn't happen on large-scale development. And I usually explain it by looking at how slow large products actually change. Like some of the products we've been working on, they're already developed for about 20 to 30 years. And most of their practices were copied from the products that were developed before that. So making change in large products, first of all, takes a lot of time. You have to be really, really patient. And second, large products are often risk avoidance in change. So there's just much less large products who have tried to do agile development, and therefore, if you would measure or research the type of development styles, development methods used in projects, I bet at this moment it will still be all small projects mainly use agile development, large projects mainly use waterfall development. And so the slowness of change and the slowness of the feedback or the success cycle on large products is how I would explain Kaper's research results. Though having read part of his latest book, I have to say he does seem to have quite a lot of misunderstandings of what Scrum or Agile development actually is. So part of that might also be related to his own misunderstandings. Anyway, my experiences are not that it doesn't work on large products, but the opposite, that traditional development doesn't work on large products, and that agile development is tough. It's a big change, but it works better than traditional development.
When I read your books, it's clear to notice that you base your methodology, your recommendations on Scrum. So why do you base on Scrum? What kind of benefits do you have from it?
I think that goes back to how we got started in Nokia networks at that time. We believe very strongly that people and projects should choose their own way of working, and not to make an organizational-wide agile process and then deploy it or roll it out to the rest of the organization. And luckily, we were not in a position where we could even do that. Because we were putting the organization in a place where we had absolutely no authority over any other development organizations. So what we did, how we started, was we gave introductions to agile development in general, where we would explain extreme programming, explain Scrum, explain feature-driven development, Crystal, and other agile methods. And we would ask the development groups, which one would you like to try out? And most of the development groups replied like, well, Scrum, that sounds pretty easy. Extreme programming sounds like a too big change. It sounds too extreme. But let's try out Scrum. It sounds easy. And of course, all of them, after they started, all of them realized that it's not easy at all, and it is a big change. But the simplicity of Scrum makes it a really good starting point. So at that time, we got started with Scrum as a framework, and then next to that, promoted the technical practices which came from extreme programming. And I think that's the background how we got started with Scrum as a basis. But looking back, Scrum does provide the structure you need to be able to scale up agile development. Extreme programming also provides that, and in my opinion, a good Scrum team and a good extreme programming team are the same. There's no difference. If a team gets really good in agile development, it doesn't really matter anymore what they call it. But Scrum provided the minimum framework that was excellent, and an excellent basis for thinking about how to scale that up.
Which agile practices don't work in large setups, and ask the other way around, which are especially important?
I don't think there's much practices that don't work in large-scale organizations or large-scale development. And the reason is that some of the additional practices we use for scaling up agile development try to create an environment where the within one team in a larger development group, the experience is nearly the same as if you were only on a one team project. So within that one team, almost all of the agile development practices would be the same. And of course, if the team is distributed inside the team, which I wouldn't recommend, then of course the practices of working together in workshops become a lot harder. But it's the distribution in that sense is harder than the scale. The other way around, there are a couple of practices which I consider to be the most important practices to pay attention to when scaling agile development. The first one is continuous integration. Continuous integration, both the continuously integrating and having a continuous integration system with lots of automated tests. It provides the basis for multiple teams to work on the same code base, and therefore I consider continuous integration the key practice that an organization needs to work on when they start scaling agile development. And then at the same time or after that, the practice of feature teams, so restructuring your organization so that the teams are structured around customer-centric features rather than subsystems or components of the architecture, enables the teams to work much more independent, and it reduces the planning and coordination needs between the teams. So continuous integration together with feature teams, I consider to be the key practices when scaling up agile development.
Very, very interesting. So I actually had very similar experiences in the company that I work for when we did our HR transition. And it's nice to get it confirming from the master, basically. Very nice. So what are the main impediments in large organizations for getting agile?
For getting agile? Well, there's an enormous amount of impediments in large organizations, and me and Craig actually published an article related to that called the top 10 impediments for agile development. So I recommend looking at that for more information. So the main impediments are, for example, traditional functional organizations focus on individual performance rather than on team performance, and everything structured around individual responsibility versus team's responsibility. Not very developed development practices, because most large organizations don't train their developers very well. Instead, they assume that universities did that, which is a wrong assumption. Very localized silos, local optimization thinking, such as distributing your development and then saving on travel cost, which of course shows well on the balance sheet, but it will lower your productivity significantly. But that one is not measured, so they will never know. So all these kind of things. It's usually in large organizations you're not short of impediments, and it will take a long time for them to be resolved. It will probably take forever to get them all resolved.
You mentioned that there is a distinction between distributed software development and scaling software development, and that doing distributed software development is harder than only scaling to a large software development team. So where's a limit where you say, well, now the distribution corrupts my software development and it's not feasible anymore to produce any way, in any case, software efficiently?
I usually would recommend against any type of distribution. Having all people located in the same location, I'd say almost per definition creates the most efficient development. Now, I'm not saying that I've worked on projects which are co-located, because I've never worked on a project which is large and co-located in one building. All large products I've worked on or I've seen are by definition distributed, and it's more how do you deal with that, and if you have distribution, the first thing I would recommend is to try to avoid distribution within the teams, but have instead distribution between teams, so that inside one team all the people are co-located and they can sit in a team room and etc. 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 But that there is different teams working from different sites. It's still painful, but it's slightly less painful than distribution inside the team. And then try to avoid as much having teams in different time zones, because that just makes the synchronization between the teams very, very painful. Like I work here in Singapore, and we worked with a small project where they had people in Singapore and people in New York, and it's a 12-hour time zone difference, and those are just very, very painful to try to deal with them. Now, one of the problems with the recommendation I just gave to try to get the distribution between teams rather than inside teams is that once you work with a traditional development group, then usually they're structured around the architecture still, so they have component teams. And if they're then distributed, then the distribution also is according to their architecture. So if you would switch from component teams to feature teams in that organization, then either one of the sites will need to learn a lot about the technology or the components that the other site has been specializing in, or you need to do distribution within the team. So there's no easy way to resolve that problem when making the switch from component to feature teams.
I see.
And I think you have probably experienced that yourself.
I'm experiencing that myself since 3 years, and I'm continue to experience it for the next years. It's a painful process.
Yeah. So at least now we do recommend to always do a gradual feature team adoption and not change over everything at once, because that is just it works, but you get all the pain at once, and it sometimes leads to even people quitting. But doing a gradual transition works pretty well, and then you might, for example, in the beginning, temporarily have a team that is distributed within the team. But then for the main purpose of trying to get the knowledge distributed better over the sites also. But on a longer run, I would then try to avoid that kind of teams especially.
And people take time. We humans take time to learn, to accept, to move on, to make things happen, to do the transition.
Absolutely.
I realized... Initially, I thought it would take weeks, But then I soon realized it will take months, it will take years till such a transition from a traditional software process to a lean software process actually happens.
Yeah, usually when working with organizations, I one of the first things I tell them is that that it will take a long time, and second, that they shouldn't be thinking about when it's finished, but they should just consider it as an never-ending thing.
It might be hard to accept by managers that it's never ending. Well, everything has an ending. Everything is packed into a project. So there's typically a transition project. But if something has no end, it's by definition no project anymore.
Exactly. And it's fun to try to convince management about such things in one of their first meetings, which there will be so much different assumptions that it's hard to even have a conversation.
So what is your experience with that? Do you like to share some insights on how to convince management?
Well, I don't think I have much insights. As you already said, most managers, or in fact all of them, at least the ones I know, they are people, and people take time to learn. So I don't. If I meet with management of an organization, I don't have the illusion that I can just say X and then they're convinced and realizing what they're starting. So the learning is just gradual, and what I do typically is try to, as early on, explain the kind of huge differences or the huge changes they can expect. And I think usually that's not believed. It's like one organization, I said that within their organization it's probably going to take 10 to 20 years to make some serious progress on this. And the answer was, no, we have an execution culture. We can do this in 1 year. And then I just said, okay, well, I'd be impressed to see that. And I think they're now in their 4th year.
Do I need to consider something in my software design to make dispersed teams work on the product?
So to get the background of the question a bit, in traditional development, typically architects or the architecture tries to freeze interfaces. And one of the reasons for fixing interfaces is that the software interfaces become the communication channels between the teams, because the teams map to the software, etc. One of the difficult changes from architecture perspective is that if you move towards feature teams, then the component chain or the interface changes should almost always be inside the one team which is implementing the feature. And because of that, there's usually not much benefits for freezing the interfaces or fixing the interfaces, because the software interfaces are no longer the communication channels between the teams. And this is actually one of the hardest changes in some of the products I worked with, because they are so used to having to fix the interfaces that they have this huge interface change process and interface repositories and things like that into place, which actually makes it really, really hard to change the interface. So even if the interface is only within a certain team, then the infrastructure they set up around their interfaces make it impossible to change it, even though from the programming language perspective it would be simply adding a parameter or something like that. So no, Normally, there's not much need to change to fix the interfaces anymore.
How do you deal with consistency? Consistency in design, consistency in the architecture of the software piece the teams are producing. Do you allow dedicated roles like architects in the setup?
Allow is of course the wrong verb there, because usually, or I don't think I ever have the authority to say I disallow. Anyway, I understand the question. Let me think about how to frame that. I'll start with the roles. I do think architectural specialization is useful. And with architectural specialization, I mean people who specialize in trying to have an overview and trying to figure out what the tough architectural decisions or questions are within their system. I don't see much use of assigning a role to that person, because often when you create a role, it also limits the type of work that such a person does. And I would definitely not recommend to have the architects working outside of the teams. So a person with an architectural specialization would be a person inside the team who has a big interest in looking at the overall and looking at architectural decisions. Now, sometimes in organizations there has been so much specialization that the persons who can focus on architectural decisions are very rare. There's only a few of them, and then product groups often make the argument that they don't want to put that person inside a team because that would limit their usage. So one of the practices or one of the experiments we recommend in our second book is to try out something which we call travelers. And travelers are people who you basically set free. So you have a group of people who are technically incredibly good or have a good overview or good history of the system. And every iteration, you let them decide which team they join. And they join one team dedicated for an iteration. And then after that, they go where their knowledge is most needed. So they look for another team and they join that other team. And when they join a team, of course, their main purpose is to share their specialization, their specialized knowledge with the rest of the team, so that the organization becomes less dependent on their specialized knowledge. And we've done that with some products, and it was quite interesting. There was a group of 6 people who were the most technical capable persons in the product, and 4 of them actually decided to just stay with one team and never change to another team, and 2 enjoyed their role of jumping from one team to the other team. And next to that, it is useful to have informal groups, which are sometimes called community of practice, which are volunteering groups of people with similar interest who get together to talk about that similar interest. And that is definitely one, there should be definitely one related to architecture, where these people inside the team will specialize on architecture. They can join this informal community of people, talk about that, and try to make architectural decisions still.
That's interesting. And And also confirming, because in our Agile transition, we have now also built up a community of practice for the architectural specialization, but also for other disciplines like testing, like for Scrum Masters. I guess this is also one of the recommendations in your book, to install communities of practice that then hold together the large setup again, right?
Absolutely. If you move to cross-functional self-managing teams and you abandon the traditional matrix organization so that there's a very clear team responsibility, then some of the functional specialization might get lost. And putting an informal volunteering organization such as communities of practice over the formal organization to not forget the focus on functional specialization also is really important.
What are your key takeaways after all those years of consulting and coaching large agile software development organizations?
Well, I don't think I have key takeaways, in the sense that if you would ask me the same question tomorrow, you would probably get a different answer. But I'll just mention what's on my mind now and some of the things that we've used when working on an agile transition. One of my rules for organizing my work and my time is always to work with people who are interested and do not work with people who are not interested. And sometimes I say ignore them, but that's not necessarily what I mean. What I mean by that is that often in a transition, there's a lot of effort going into convincing people who are just not ready to be convinced. And it's often more useful to take the people who are interested and ready and work with them and use their enthusiasm to create results. And then let the people who are not interested or not ready yet, let them learn at their own speed. So give them the space for them to learn rather than pushing them around all the time, which is what I often see happening in transitions. So that would be one takeaway.
You work with large projects, you support organizational change, yet you still develop. For example, you're the author of the open source unit test framework CPP U-Test. It is a rare combination to keep developing. Why do you do that?
So CPP U-Test is a project I work on together with James Grenning. Just to promote his upcoming work a bit, James, one of the Agile Manifesto signees, has a book coming up called TDD in C for embedded systems. And many large products are embedded systems, and many large products use C, so then you probably want to pick up his book, which should be out in November. But that wasn't the question. My favorite role in a large product is to work on the lowest level and the highest level, and try to not work too much with the levels in between. And the lowest level, I mean then work on code, so actually pair up with developers, look at their code base, look at their practices on development level. And the highest, I mean then the people running the whole product. And the typically 2-3 layers of management in between, I tend to work a little bit less with, or prefer that also, so that there's a direct link between the developers and the people trying to make the organizational change decisions. And I do that because, in my opinion, almost all problems that an organization has are visible. They are right there. They're in their code. Just nobody is looking. So if you look at their code base, any problems or any impediments within their organizations will be visible in their code base. So looking at their code base gives an enormous amount of input in what the actual impediments are in the organization and what the focus points need to be. And I consider that important because I worked in large organizations for a long time, and there's often managers creating work for each other, where they're saying this is an impediment and you need to solve it, and then they have meetings and then they track it, etc. But when you go to the lowest level, if you go to the development level, if you go to the code level, often the things they're working on are just not relevant on that level. So staying close to code usually keeps me real. It keeps me focused on the things that will have that impact the day-to-day life of the people who are creating the product. And I think that is very important. And I try to avoid specializing only in development or only in organizational advice or only in agile development, and try to keep broad, because keeping broad also helps you see the overview and makes you give different advice.
That was a very nice pearl of wisdom, actually. And we're coming to the end of our show. Do you have something you like to share with our listeners?
Well, we already shared quite a lot, I guess.
So then it's fine, and we use that last pearl of wisdom to really stay connected across all levels of hierarchy, especially connect the topmost with the actual implementation level as the final word. So I would like to thank you, Bas. That was very interesting, and hope to talk to you soon in real person, in real life, meeting somewhere at some place.
Won't be soon unless you go to Asia. As you know, nowadays I rarely leave Asia.
Okay, then I say bye-bye.
Well, maybe in the next Agile conference if you're going to be there.
I'll try to. So thanks for the recording, for taking the time. Bye-bye, Bas.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. SE Radio is an educational program brought to you by Hillside Europe. If you want more information about the podcast and the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons, or by talking about us on Twitter and Facebook. You can also support us by joining the team and shouldering some of the work. To contact the team, please send email to team@se-radio.net, or if your feedback is specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can react to your comments. This episode of SE Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details.